Καλησπέρα σας. Είμαστε στο Βιβλιοβούλιο Κυριακή βράδυ και έχουμε απόψε την ιδιαίτερη χαρά και τιμή να φιλοξενούμε τον κύριο Σβεν Μπέκερτ, ο οποίος είναι ιστορικός, είναι καθηγητής Αμερικανικής Ιστορίας στο Πανεπιστήμιο Χάρβαρντ και είμαστε εδώ για να κουβεντιάσουμε ένα βιβλίο που βγήκε πολύ πρόσφατα δικό του από τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης. Λέγεται «Η Αυτοκρατορία του Βαμβακιού». Ένα βιβλίο πολύ ενδιαφέρον, το οποίο μιλάει για το βαμβάκι και τα όσα συνέβησαν στο 19ο αιώνα. Άλλωστε, ο κύριος Μπέκερτ είναι ειδικός στην ιστορία του 19ου αιώνα. Αλλά επεκτείνεται και πολύ πέρα από αυτό, καθώς το βαμβάκι είναι ένα παράδειγμα για το πώς λειτουργήσε η παγκόσμια οικονομία ήδη από πολύ νωρίς. Mr. Beckert, we are very happy to have you here with us today. Βιβλιοβούλιο is the name of our TV show, our channel's book show. I would like to ask to begin with an innocent question. Why should we talk about cotton today?
No, that is a great question, and I'm delighted to be here, so thank you for having me. Why did I decide to write on the history of cotton? It started, as you mentioned, I'm a historian of the United States, and when you study American history, you learn quickly that for understanding the history of the United States in the 19th century, cotton played a very important role because cotton was the most important export product of the United States until the 1860s, and cotton was, of course, deeply involved in the institution of slavery. So any historian of the United States of the 19th century has in some ways thought about cotton. But I'm a historian of the United States, but I wasn't born in the United States. So I always was thinking about ways how I can embed American history in a greater global framework. And I was very interested in questions of economic history, social history, the history of capitalism. And when I thought about what I should write my next book about, it dawned on me that maybe focusing on a commodity, focusing on a thing, would allow me to embed American history in a larger global context. And of course, the commodity that came to mind, if you think about the United States, was cotton. And at the beginning, when I started researching this project, I thought, I didn't know much about the global history of cotton, so I thought it's a story about the United States, it's a story about the United Kingdom because of cotton industrialization, it's a story about India because of its long-term involvement in cotton production and growing, and maybe it's a little bit of a story about Egypt, but I had no idea how global it would be. But once I started researching, I understood that it's a much more global story. It involves many, many more countries than I had originally thought. For example, it does also involve Greeks and Greece itself. But also I increasingly began to understand that this is really important to understanding the making of modern capitalism and thus the world in which we all live in today. And so I decided to go into the really global account of the history of this industry in the past 500 years.
Okay. When exactly did this process of reorganizing trade, cotton trade, production, consumption begin, and when did the new machines enter the production process?
So the manufacturing of cotton textiles is one of the oldest activities that humans have engaged in. And we know that people in places such as India, but also Eastern Africa and Latin America have produced cotton textiles for about 5,000 years. And maybe longer, but we don't know. But for 5,000 years, people have produced cotton textiles. And from those parts of the world, cotton spread to other areas of the world, let's say to Anatolia, or to Western Africa, or to the northern parts of the American continent. And by the year 1000, the industry was the most important manufacturing activity that humans engaged in. So no other manufacturing activity in the world as a whole by the year 1000 was more important than cotton. But in all parts of the world, it was basically small farmers growing cotton, and then they would spin it, and then they would weave it, and then they would produce textiles that they would consume themselves. So this was basically how that industry looked throughout the world for about 4,800 years. And as you know, by the 16th century, as European power expanded into other parts of the world, Europeans were very eager to acquire these textiles because they were preferable to some of the things that they produced themselves in Europe. And eventually they tried to copy them. They tried to manufacture them in Europe as well. And at first they manufactured them just like they manufactured them in India or in Africa or in Latin America. These were people in the countryside who would get cotton from, let's say, Greek merchants, and they would spin them and weave them, but they would sell them into markets. They would not just consume them themselves, but they would sell them into markets. And that industry expanded rapidly, especially in the 18th century. And it became clear to especially British artisans, because Britain, as the most important imperial power, of course, was very deeply involved in these kinds of networks of cotton trade and cotton manufacturing. And so British artisans began to understand that there was potentially a huge market if you would find a way to produce these cotton textiles more cheaply than they were produced in India, where most cottons at this point came from, including the cottons consumed on the European continent. And they improved their machines by the 1730s, 1740s, and by the 1780s, they had found ways to vastly improve the spinning of cotton, so to make the thread. And even the early cotton spinning machines were like 200 times more efficient than doing it by hand. And at this point now, British cottons were still in quality, they weren't as good as the Indian ones, but they could be produced much cheaper. And now we have a world in which cotton is the most important industry globally, and a world in which most people in most of the world, except in Europe, for thousands of years had already consumed cotton textiles. So there was a huge market now for these things that British industry produced. And these machines then would improve drastically in the early years of the 19th century. And this was the starting point of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in cottons. And of course, the Industrial Revolution, I would argue, is one of the most important events in human history. It created everything about the modern world in which we live in today is a result of that Industrial Revolution, and it all began with cottons.
Okay. Now, what would a world without cotton be like? What products is it used for besides clothes?
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, cotton is the kind of thing we never think about it. It's almost like the air we breathe. It's all around us, but because it's so common, we never think about it. But cotton is really everywhere, even today. So, for example, of course, as you mentioned, the clothing you're wearing right now, as you're listening to this show, much of it will be produced with cottons. But also, if you pay, if you use banknotes, they are being produced with cotton fiber. Gunpowder used to be made with cotton fiber. Furniture, cotton is almost anywhere. Cottonseed oil is, of course, something that comes from the cotton plant as well. So the cotton plant kind of permeates modern life as we know it and has done for a long time. But of course, the most important use has been as a fiber to make thread and to produce clothing. And it was until the 1990s, so until 20 years or 30 years ago, it was by far the world's most important textile fiber. This is how most people got their clothing. That has changed now in recent years as synthetic fibers have become much more important. But until very recently, cotton was the most important fiber we used for manufacturing of clothing.
And you say in the book, I think, that if we didn't have the cotton, we had to have too many sheep, I think. It's something,
so people have, this is, I mean, people have calculated that. They have said, the cotton is, maybe I should say a few words about this, is particular because it does connect producers on very many different continents. So cotton, as you know, doesn't really grow in Europe except for Greece, but not in great quantities. But during the moment of the Industrial Revolution, most cotton was grown by enslaved workers in the United States. And of course, it was manufactured mostly in Europe, and it was consumed all over the world. So it's a very a very international industry, and it was at the root of the Industrial Revolution. Now people have argued, but what about wool? Could it not have all happened just with wool? You know, the British sheep, the Irish sheep, and industrialization could have happened in the wool industry. And there are two arguments against that. One, mechanizing the spinning of wool is more difficult than mechanizing the spinning of cotton because of the properties of the fiber. But more important, where would all that wool come from? So people have calculated if there would be a wool equivalent to the cotton used during the Industrial Revolution, the entire British Isles would have had to be committed to sheep agriculture because the sheep need a lot of space. So it would have, there would have been ecological constraints because there's only so much space to grow all these sheep, but there would also have been social constraints because, of course, there were landowners in Britain who had different ideas of what should happen with the land, and people living on the land who didn't want the sheep to take over the land. So there were constraints to that. But cotton was unique because cotton, as I mentioned earlier, was grown on another continent, in the Americas. And in the Americas, there were people too. But they were pushed off the land. The indigenous people of America were pushed off the land. And then the labor was brought in from elsewhere, namely from Africa.
Why finally did Europe and Great Britain dominate the cotton trade? What is the, why, for example, not in China or in India? The same questions for the Industrial Revolution, probably.
Exactly.
But, yeah.
No, exactly. And this is, of course, a very important question for understanding, how the inequalities and the hierarchies of the modern world came about. Because this is really at the core. Europe wasn't wealthier in 1800 than China. It only became wealthier after the Industrial Revolution. And so the question is important of why that process didn't initiate in China or in India, and in some ways it's even more puzzling because China was technically ahead of Europe also when it came to spinning of fibers, and India was in many ways technically ahead in the production of cotton fibers, cotton textiles as well. Even in the 19th century when industrialization in Britain had occurred, the best fabrics still came from India, not from the United Kingdom. So how was the United Kingdom different from India and China? That's basically the issue we need to think about. And my argument in the book is that it's not just about, that British artisans are unusually smart and they are unusually capable of inventing new machines. Certainly they were smart and they did invent important machines. But why did they do so? And that relates to what we said earlier. They did so because they had great incentives of doing so. And of course, they were part of a nation that had reshaped the world through its imperial expansion. It had completely reshaped the world. It had captured the Americas. It had played an important role in the trade in enslaved workers. It had captured India, and it had important access to Indian markets. So my argument is in the book that it's not so much the technical innovations that explain it, but we need to go a little bit before that and see that the way how Britain and also France and other European powers inserted themselves into the global economy, this is really what set this process in motion.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk a little bit about Greek merchants. There is a well-known personality here. His name is Emmanuel Benakis. There is a road near here, and with his name, and there is, of course, a very big museum, Benakis Museum. It's one of the most important museums in Athens. Yeah. This guy, Emmanuel Benakis, was born in 1843 and died in 1929. So he went to Manchester to study, and after that he settled in Egypt in 1865. And of course he engaged in the cotton trade. There are other families, of course. Yeah. But How much you think did the Greek cotton merchants in the Nile Delta participate in this world history of cotton?
I think they played a really important role. And this goes partly back to the discussion that we had earlier. The Industrial Revolution was not just about new machines. It was also about connecting people across the globe in entirely novel ways. And the people who did the connecting were, of course, merchants. So the book has a whole chapter on these merchant communities because I'm arguing that these merchant communities were really crucial in shaping modern capitalism and the modern world as we know it. And Greek merchants came to play a very important role in this trade. Of course, primarily the Egyptian cotton trade, which was really dominated by Greek merchants in Alexandria, and Egyptian cotton played an important role by the 1840s, 1850s in the British and more large the European cotton industry, but Greek merchants also branched out, as you mentioned. They also traded in American cotton and other kinds of cottons. Many Greek merchants sent their sons to London or to Liverpool or to Manchester, so they were actually pretty substantial Greek immigrant communities, all attached to the cotton trade. A famous Greek family was from the island of Chios, the Rallis.
Rallis, yes.
Who played they were really one of the world's most important cotton merchants. And I think partly, why is that so? I mean, partly it was because the Greeks had a long tradition of being involved in global trade, in shipping. They had long-term connections to Egypt, so they were a long historical antecedents to that. But also the word of international trade in the 19th century before is a word of great risk. Because communication wasn't what it is today. There was no internet. You didn't know what the market in Liverpool was really like unless you went to Liverpool, and that took a long time to go to Liverpool from Alexandria. And so you needed to have people in these different parts of the world whom you could trust, and the people you could trust the most were members of your own family. And so all of these Greek, I don't know if all, but at least the Greek families that I know of who played an important role in the cotton trade, they drew on these networks of trust. And it was either their family, which was, the Rallis were literally all over the world. I mean, they sent their sons, to all places around the world that played a role in global cotton. So in a way, just looking at this family gives you a sense of the global scope of this industry. But if the family wasn't big enough, then they drew on people from their home places and, people from the same island, for example. And I think it's the nature of trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, the need to be able to trust the people you trade with, that put great emphasis on family and place of origins.
Now, as you say, everything starts at the end of the 18th century. The second part of 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century is also the age of revolutions.
Yeah.
And the question is, revolutions played no part in all this.
Yeah, no, I know. There's not much of a discussion, let's say, of the French Revolution or the Greek Revolution or the American Revolution in the book. Of course, these revolutions played a role in the sense that they created a politics that is important to the making of the modern world as well. So I would not argue that they didn't matter. They mattered greatly. In the American context, which is what I know the best, the American Revolution mattered greatly because it divorced the United States from Great Britain. Before that, obviously, what is now the United States was mostly part of the United Kingdom. As you know, in 1834, Britain abolished slavery. Yes, so in the British possessions, like in Barbados, Jamaica, slavery was illegal after 1834. Now, the beauty of this separation that came out of the American Revolution was that slavery was illegal in Britain, but still the most important import product, the most important commodity of the industrial world in the early 19th century was still produced by enslaved people, but not in a British colony, but in the independent United States, where slavery was legal until 1865. So in that way, that revolution, I think, is actually quite crucial to understanding the trajectory of the empire of cotton.
So the history of cotton goes hand in hand with the history of capitalism in a way. Do you think that capitalism goes hand in hand with democracy, or that it is connected, or is there no necessary connection between them?
I mean, this is a very, very big question, and of course, you know, it's in a way it's also an ongoing process. We live in that world today, so we don't, in the end, really know, because there is still a future that we can't predict. Of course, in the 1950s, 1960s, there was something called modernization theory, and people convinced themselves that the expansion of capitalism goes hand in hand with the expansion of liberal democracy. And yes, there are reasons to believe that, because capitalism expanded, and especially after, let's say, 1800, and while there were few liberal democratic regimes in the 19th century, but there were many more in the 20th century. So there was kind of an expansion of liberal democracy under capitalism. And so that could lend you the confidence to say, yes, the capitalism leads to more liberal democratic regimes. And that might be completely true. But there are also counterexamples. I mean, we see in the 20th century some most dynamic parts of global capitalism in the 20th century, let's say Germany and Italy, they opted out of the liberal democratic model. If you look at the most significant, most dynamic places of global capitalism today, China, for example, I don't think many people would describe them as liberal democratic regimes. So I think this is still not clear. But I think what we can now say definitely is that the kind of optimism that people had in the 1950s and 1960s, that there is kind of an automatic relationship between the expansion of capitalism, the emergence of a middle class who then is going to vote and is going to create a liberal democratic regime. That optimism, I don't have that optimism anymore today. That doesn't mean that there's no relationship between the two, but I think it's much more complicated. Democracy is a work in progress, and democracy needs people who defend it and who fight for it. It's not an automatic outcome of the capitalist revolution. You have talked about also about war capitalism at the beginning. That seems that the use of slavery and land occupation acquisition. So is that right? This is how the first funds were raised? Is it that way that we'll have to see? So I don't know how that is in Greece. I can't speak to that, but certainly in the United States or in much of Western Europe, there is a kind of sense that the expansion of capitalism, the emergence of capitalism, was built on, inventive people like the artisans we mentioned earlier, on a certain set of liberal institutions, maybe even democracy, what we just discussed, and this is not completely wrong, as I said earlier, but looking at the history of cotton really made me think in different ways about the history of capitalism as well. Because what you can see in the book is that cotton is really quite crucial to the history of capitalism. And what you see in the history of cotton is that its early history was based on an enormous degree of violence. First, the dispossession of the people who used to own the land on which cotton was grown, and then, of course, also enslavement. But even when the enslaving of the people who grew the cotton, almost all cotton in the 19th century was grown by enslaved people. And then, but also if you look at early factories, they were often quite coercive in nature. So you see a degree of violence and of dispossession that is quite astounding. If most people think about capitalism, they think about contracts. They don't think about enslavement. If you think about capitalism, you think about property rights. But really, the history of capitalism is about dispossession, just taking people's property away. And of course, this is an ongoing process, so this is not just the 18th and 19th century, but it's bundled in the 17th, 18th century, and early 19th century. It's particularly central to the dynamic of the unfolding of capitalism. And that's why I decided this is fundamentally different from the industrial capitalism that comes, let's say, in the late 19th and early 20th century. And therefore, I looked for a different word to describe this kind of capitalism, and I decided to name it war capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Contrary to the image we have of the industry, where initially mainly men worked, in cotton was mainly worked by women. Yeah. So was this happening everywhere, and why?
Yeah, it's so. Let me maybe just step back a little bit. The book is about a lot of different actors. As you know, like we have the merchants, like the Greek merchants we mentioned. We have these British imperial bureaucrats, but the book is also about enslaved people. It's about workers, and they appear in the book. So there's a lot of colorful characters that like drive. It's not really an abstract book. It's a book that tells a lot of stories as well. And
that's true.
And one of the stories is about these female workers, because the Industrial Revolution was really made by women. It's the women who end up in the factories in very large numbers. I mean, they're also men, but in much smaller numbers than the women. And it's especially girls, like young women. So the Industrial Revolution was made by girls in some ways. And why is that so? It is because I think throughout the world, people didn't want to end up working in factories. They much preferred, even if they weren't that wealthy, they preferred to retain access to the land, to grow their own crops, to have a sense of independence. And they knew that life in factories, in the early factories, was really quite terrible. And so who were the people who were least able to resist being put into factories? These were children, especially orphans who didn't have any parents. And of course, it were women who had a less powerful position in society, but also within their own families. So if a peasant family wasn't doing particularly well, they would send their women to work in the factory to make some extra income that often allowed them actually to stay on the land. So they were able to stay farmers or peasants because the women, and the young women especially, ended up working in the factories. And this raises now a bigger problem, namely, why is it that when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we think mostly about men? We think about coal mining, about the steel industry, and of course in these industries, most people working there were men. But it turns out that in terms of employment, the cotton industry was way more important throughout the 19th century. Many more people worked in the cotton industry than worked in a steel mill or worked on coal mining. And I think we partly have forgotten that history because it was exactly as you say, because it was so dominated by women, by female labor.
Now, cotton made possible the birth of capitalism, as you said, as well as its subsequent reinvention. You also talk about the ever-changing political economy of capitalism. So, which were its next steps after cotton?
Yes, so the book argues that that cotton is important, very important to the history of capitalism. But of course, I would never want to argue that, you know, you can understand everything about capitalism just by looking at cotton, because there's more to capitalism than just cotton. And what comes next, of course, is the industries that I just mentioned: coal mining, steel, the railroads, the chemical industry, the electrical machinery industry, then the automobile industry. So cotton remains important. I mean, even in the late 19th century, more people work in the cotton industry than in any other industry in Europe. So it's astonishingly important. I didn't understand that myself at the beginning, because our image is so much, you know, these gigantic factories in Detroit or Pittsburgh or in parts of Germany or the United Kingdom. But cotton remains really, really important. But other industries are, of course, becoming more central. So if you think about the 20th century, for example, and you want to focus on a commodity, you would want to focus on oil, not cotton. Interestingly enough, Greeks play an important role in that as well. I don't know why that is so. I have no explanation. But other commodities become much more central in this history. But when it comes to the kind of origins of the world in which we live right now, then cotton is really at its center.
According to you, globalization has been around since the heyday of the Cotton Empire.
Yeah.
The difference today is that capitalists can, for the first time, emancipate themselves from individual nation states. And that is, in the previous phases, they needed the state, and now much less. Why is this happening, in your opinion?
Yeah, so this relates again to the previous discussion on the kind of different kinds of political economies. So especially by the late 19th century, and then throughout much of the 20th century until the 1970s, there was a strong attachment of ever more powerful nation states and national industries. And, you know, I don't know much about Greek economic history, but of course, Greece went through this kind of nationalist industrialization process in those years as well. So here we see a kind of correspondence between national capital and stronger nation states. By the 1970s, this begins to dissolve, and capital became, in some sense, much more powerful because it was able to emancipate itself from a particular nation state. Capital became much more mobile, partly as a result of that different industries now emerge as central that are not as attached to a particular place. Like a steel mill, if you own a steel mill, it's very difficult to say, oh, you know what, labor costs are too high in Pittsburgh, I'm going to move the whole thing to Honduras. You know, that's impossible. But if you own if you own an electronics manufacturing, a TV assembly plant, you know, you can say, okay, labor costs are too expensive in Greece, you know, let's move the whole thing to Albania, and it's actually possible. So it's partly the nature of production itself that allows this greater mobility of capital, but then, of course, there's also a great degree of global deregulation that makes this capital mobility possible. But in the end, it's increasingly a world in which capital can pick its nation state. It can, you know, I don't like Greece because whatever, they have certain labor standards. I'll just move to whatever, some other country. I move to Somalia or to, you know, I mean, this is a little radical, but I move to Egypt, let's say. Because they have lower labor standards, I can produce cheaper. This, though, what is really important is, I would not argue that the state matters less. The state matters greatly today as well. But the relative power between agglomerations of capital and states has shifted, and now it's increasingly capital that kind of can pick its state instead of this kind of merger of state power and capital that we had seen for much of the history of capitalism previously.
Now, history today, you said also in your book, is rethinking itself.
now in transnational or even global content. A great unknown in the Western world is China. Now, other major fields of activity beyond cotton that must be included by Western historians under this new gaze?
Yes, I think we need to reconsider a lot of the history that we've written in the past in the national framework in light of a more global perspective. I mean, history, the history of modern history writing began in the 19th century, and it began at the moment when nation states were constituted. And of course, history itself played an important role in the constitution of these nation states, because it were historians who told everybody, you know, there's kind of an ancient France or Germany or Britain, and they wrote these national histories partly to constitute the nation state itself. But as we increasingly see, many historical problems are not best understood by looking at history from a national perspective, because the process, as you see in the book, they push against these boundaries, beyond these boundaries. You can't understand the Raleighs and Keoghs without thinking about them in really global terms. And interestingly enough, they themselves thought about the world in those terms. They were not just Greek nationalists, they thought about, you know, the world as a whole. And we live in an interconnected community, and we have lived in an interconnected community for at least 500 years. So in order to understand how the world in which we live right now, which of course is something most of us are concerned with, how this came into being, it's not sufficient just to look at national histories. Of course, and we need to look at it in global perspectives. Of course, national histories matter, and they should be written, and they're important. I'm not arguing against that, but I think there are a lot of historical questions that we cannot really answer without also thinking about them in a global perspective, and this is exactly what the book tries to do.
Mr. Beckett, thank you very much for being here. It was a very rich discussion, I think, and a journey by ship, by train, by imagination. In our global past. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Ας δούμε και τη δική μας βιτρίνα με τα βιβλία. Σταυρούλα, γεια σου.
Γεια σου, Μανώλη. Ξεκινάω με ένα πάρα πολύ ωραίο βιβλίο, ενδιαφέρον, σου μαθαίνει πολλά πράγματα και είναι και φοβερά καλογραμμένο, του Εμμανουέλ Καρέρ, V13, μετάφραση Γιώργος Καράμπελας, εκδόσεις του 21ου. Γράφει πάρα πολύ καλά. Ακόμα και κάποιοι που δεν έχουν διαβάσει τίποτε δικό του, ίσως έχουν δει ταινίες που βασίζονται σε βιβλία του, όπως τα μαθήματα στο χιόνι, ο εχθρός. Ο εχθρός είναι αυτή η ιστορία, l'adversaire, με έναν τύπο που εργαζόταν στον Παγκόσμιο Οργανισμό Υγείας ή έλεγε ότι εργαζόταν εκεί. Πάντως για 18 χρόνια δεν εργαζόταν, υποδιότανε ότι εργάζεται.
Το θυμάμαι,
και στο τέλος σκότωσε όλη του την οικογένεια. Και πήγε και τον γνώρισε στη φυλακή ο Καρέρ και έκανε ένα βιβλίο μετά. Λοιπόν, εδώ είναι το χρονικό μιας πολύκροτης δίκης που έγινε στο Παρίσι το 1921 και αφορούσε τις αλλεπάλληλες βομβιστικές επιθέσεις του Νοεμβρίου του 1915.
Μπατακλάν,
δηλαδή. Μπατακλάν, διάφορα καφέ, το στάδιο της Γαλλίας. Και η δίκη αυτή που έγινε κράτησε 9 μήνες και ο Καρέρ δήλωσε στο Νουβέλο Observateur την πρόθεσή του να την καλύψει. Όχι δημοσιογραφικά, σαν χρονικογράφος. Και πάνω που πρότεινε στο περιοδικό αυτό, ήταν έτοιμο και το περιοδικό να του το προτείνει. Δηλαδή είχαμε έναν πολύ ωραίο γάμο εκεί πέρα. Και ήταν διατεθειμένος και το έκανε να είναι κάθε μέρα στο Ile de la Cité, που είχε στηθεί μια τεράστια αίθουσα ειδική για αυτή τη δίκη, να χτυπάει κάρτα κάθε πρωί, να παρακολουθεί, να κρατάει σημειώσεις και δημοσίευε κάθε Σαββατοκύριακο ένα κείμενο.
Ξέρεις ότι στα γαλλικά δικαστήρια δεν επιτρέπεται συνήθως βιντεοσκόπηση και... Δηλαδή βλέπεις μόνο σκίτσα. Μόνο σκίτσα. Δεν επιτρέπεται καν φωτογραφία. Αλλά ο ρεπόρτερ μπορεί να είναι μέσα. Δηλαδή, δεν ξέρω αν είχε δικαίωμα να ηχογραφεί αυτό.
Δεν φαίνεται πουθενά να ηχογραφεί. Σημειώσεις κρατούσε. Λοιπόν, αυτή η δίκη Γιατί φαινόταν ελκυστική σε αυτό να πάει να την παρακολουθήσει? Γιατί σίγουρα θα ακούγονταν φοβερές ιστορίες, ακραίες εμπειρίες ζωής και θανάτου. Ήτανε, επί 2 εβδομάδες άκουγε όλους τους ειδήμονες, δηλαδή γιατρούς, νοσηλευτές, αστυνόμους, όλους αυτούς που έτρεξαν στα σημεία που γίνανε οι επιθέσεις, οι επανωτοί πυροβολισμοί. Μετά για 5 εβδομάδες ήταν ο λόγος στα θύματα. Και για πολύ μεγαλύτερο διάστημα ήταν ο λόγος στους θύτες. Και αυτό το βιβλίο μου έκανε εντύπωση γιατί προσπαθεί να καταλάβουμε τι συνέβη. Και ξεκινάει από την Αραβική Άνοιξη να αφηγείται ο Καρέρ για να μας δείξει πώς προέκυψε το Ισλαμικό κράτος, πώς προέκυψε ο Άισις, πώς οι τζιχαντιστές δηλαδή ριζοσπαστικοποιήθηκαν τόσο πολύ και προέβησαν σε τέτοιες πράξεις. Θυμίζω
είναι
ότι...
και Γάλλοι αρκετοί, έτσι, που έχουν φύγει.
Λοιπόν, αυτό είναι ένα από τα πιο ενδιαφέροντα κομμάτια του βιβλίου, γιατί υπάρχουν πολλοί Γάλλοι που έχουν τα παιδιά τους στη Συρία, τα οποία έχουν γίνει τζιχαντιστές και ο επαναπατρισμός αυτών των παιδιών γίνεται με το σταγονόμετρο. Και υπάρχει το δίλημμα, τους αφήνεις εκεί ή προσπαθείς να αφαιρέσεις από τον κόσμο μερικούς τζιχαντιστές, ναι, επαναφέροντάς τους και κάπως...
Ναι, αλλά εκεί φοβούνται ότι θα φέρουν μέσα στη Γαλλία πάλι τζιχαντιστές.
Ακριβώς, είναι δίκοπο μαχαίρι. Πάντως γίνονται επαναπατρισμοί και είναι ένα θέμα που εμείς αγνοούσαμε ότι υφίσταται. Ναι. Λοιπόν, θυμίζω ότι τον Αύγουστο του 2015...
Αυτή τη στιγμή, συγγνώμη που σε διακόπτω, επειδή έχω δει και γαλλικές ειδήσεις σχετικές, υπάρχουν στρατόπεδα στη Συρία με τζιχαντιστές που τους έχουν κλεισμένους μέσα και τα οποία φυλάνε Κούρδοι.
Μάλιστα.
Ναι. Έχει ανατεθεί στους Κούρδους η φύλαξη των στρατοπέδων με τους τζιχαντιστές, μέσα στους οποίους είναι και Γάλλοι. Υπάρχει χωριστό σέξιον με τους Ευρωπαίους.
Μάλιστα. Τώρα που είπες έχεις δει ειδήσεις, έχουν γίνει και ντοκιμαντέρ για αυτές τις επιθέσεις. Το Netflix έχει ένα επεισόδια, αλλά ο λόγος δίνεται πάντοτε στα θύματα. Και όπως είπε η βεντέτα της δίκης, ένας τύπος που συμμετείχε στις επιθέσεις, αλλά δεν ανατινάχτηκε, ούτε σκότωσε, ούτε μετάνιωσε την τελευταία στιγμή. Κάτι δεν λειτουργήσε, δεν θα μάθουμε ποτέ. Πάντως δικάστηκε, αλλά δεν είχε στο λαιμό του πυροβολισμούς. Ναι. Λοιπόν, υπήρχαν καμιά 12 τζιχαντιστές που τον Αύγουστο του 2015 τους μαζέψανε από διάφορα σημεία του κόσμου, πήγανε στο Βέλγιο και από εκεί πήγανε στο Παρίσι και το βράδυ της 13ης Νοεμβρίου αρχίσανε να περνάνε από διάφορα κεντρικά καφέ και να πυροβολούν τους ανθρώπους. Και μέσα στο κλαμπ Μπατακλάν και επίσης και στο στάδιο της Γαλλίας που εκεί δεν πήγαν καλά τα πράγματα, ανατινάχτηκε απλώς ο βομβιστής. Η βεντέτα της υπόθεσης, όταν του δόθηκε ο λόγος, είπε «Έχω την αίσθηση ότι είναι σαν σε αυτή τη δίκη να ξεφυλίζουμε ένα βιβλίο από το τέλος. Πρέπει να το πάρουμε από την αρχή». Και αυτό βλέπεις πώς πάνω σε τεντωμένο σκηνή, όντας ο Καρέρ, προσπαθεί να δείξει τι συμβαίνει, να κατανοήσουμε και τα διεθνή πράγματα και τη στάση της Γαλλίας στη Συρία. Το φωτίζει το πράγμα από 1002 μεριές. Βασικό στοιχείο του βιβλίου του είναι ιστορίες ανθρώπων μέσα από τις μαρτυρίες που έδωσαν στο δικαστήριο και από τη μια πλευρά και από την άλλη. Και επίσης βλέπουμε και πώς ο ίδιος συγχρονίστηκε με τους νομικούς, με τους συγγενείς των θυμάτων. Λέει σε ένα σημείο τους δικηγόρους της πολιτικής αγωγής, εντάξει, όλοι τους καμαρώνουμε, εντάξει. Αλλά αυτοί που αξίζουν τη μεγαλύτερη προσοχή μας και εκτίμησή μας είναι οι συνήγοροι των θητών. Γιατί εκεί η δουλειά και δεν είναι ούτε καλοπληρωμένη, υπάρχει ο κίνδυνος να ταυτιστείς με τον πελάτη σου και να κακοχαρακτηριστείς, αλλά εκεί πραγματικά νέοι δικηγόροι που ήταν διαπρεπείς στο επάγγελμά τους τα δώσανε όλα, όχι για να αθωώσουν κανέναν, αλλά για να έχουν μια τίμια δίκη. Ανάμεσα στους κατηγορούμενους ήταν και 3 φτωχοδιαβόλοι, οι οποίοι μπλέχτηκαν χωρίς να έχουν συνειδητοποιήσει σε τι υπόθεση αναμειγνύονται. Δηλαδή ήταν αυτοί που βοήθησαν τους εκτελεστές να φυγαδευτούν μετά από το Παρίσι. Αλλά δεν είχαν εικόνα του τι ακριβώς κάνουν. Και αυτοί δεν είχαν την ίδια μεταχείριση. Δηλαδή ο πολιτισμός ο νομικός...
Ξέρεις, ένα σημείο που μου φαίνεται εμένα από τα πιο δύσκολα στη συγγραφή ενός τέτοιου βιβλίου είναι η δομή.
Δηλαδή, εδώ όμως ήταν χρονικό.
Ναι, είναι χρονικό. Το παίρνει κάπως με χρονολογική σειρά. Έτσι.
Ναι, το παίρνει με χρονολογική σειρά και κάθε τόσο κάποιες ιστορίες. Αυτό έχει μαζέψει πολύ περισσότερες ιστορίες από όσες μπορεί να βάλει. Στο βιβλίο που τυπώθηκε έχει βάλει μερικές επιπλέον. Δεν είναι δηλαδή τα λεκουάλε, τα χρονογραφήματά του με την έκδοση που ακολούθησε.
Ναι. Ωραία.
Το στυλ γραφής μου αρέσει του Καρέρ πάρα πολύ. Πάρα πολύ. Πάρα πολύ. Αξίζει τον κόπο, αυτό θα μάθουμε πολλά πράγματα. Το δεύτερο βιβλίο που έχω φέρει, και είναι επίσης μου έκανε πάρα πολύ καλή εντύπωση, καμιά φορά δεν συμπίπτουν όλα, ξέρεις, κάποιο είναι πιο... Αυτό όμως, Damon Galkut, Αρκτικό καλοκαίρι, μετάφραση Κλέρη Παπαμιχαήλ από τη Διόπτρα. Ο Γκάλκουτ είναι ο συγγραφέας της Υπόσχεσης. Πριν από λίγο καιρό παρουσιάσαμε το μυθιστόρημά του που ήταν για το Apartheid. Περισσότερο. Τώρα εδώ, πώς κάνει ο Πολώστερ τη βιογραφία στο φλεγόμενο αγόρι του Στίβεν Κράιν. Εδώ ο Γκάλκουτ φιλοτεχνεί το πορτρέτο του E.M. Foster και κυρίως την περίοδο που κυοφορεί μέσα του ένα από τα διασημότερα μυθιστορήματά του, το πέρασμα στην Ινδία. Και αυτό έχει γίνει ταινία. Όλα. Και του Φώστερ, ας πούμε, αν δεν έχει διαβάσει κανείς, έχει δει το δωμάτιο με θέα, έχει δει το Μωρίς, που είναι βασισμένο σε ένα μυθιστόρημα που είχε γράψει από το 10, αλλά μετά το θάνατό του εκδόθηκε. Γιατί είναι η ομοφιλοφιλία μέσα που παίζει. Λοιπόν, εδώ ο Γκάλκουτ ταυτίζεται ως ένα βαθμό με τον Φώστερ ως προς την ομοφιλοφιλία τους. Και όπως ο Φώστερ έζησε τη δίκη του Όσκαρ Wilde, ήταν ενωπή η δίκη του Όσκαρ Wilde όταν αυτός συνειδητοποιούσε την ιδιαιτερότητά του τη σεξουαλική, έτσι και ο Γκάλκουτ επί Apartheid δεν μπορούσε ήταν στα κρυφά ομοφυλόφιλος. Οπότε εκεί κάπου συναντιόνται. Το ταξίδι στην Ινδία, που είναι από τα διασημότερα, όπως είπα, έργα του Φώστερ, είναι ένα βιβλίο πάρα πολύ δυνατό, γιατί δείχνει...
το πέρασμα στην Ινδία.
Το πέρασμα, τι είπα.
Το ταξίδι.
Όχι, το πέρασμα στην Ινδία, γιατί μιλάει για την αποικιοκρατία, για το ρατσισμό, για την καταπιεσμένη σεξουαλικότητα. Όλα αυτά, για να βγούνε στο χαρτί, χρειαστήκανε πολλά χρόνια εσωτερικών διεργασιών και ταξιδιών του Φώστερ και άντλησης εμπειριών από διάφορους τόπους και με διάφορους ανθρώπους. Και εδώ τα ζωντανεύει ο Γκάλκουτ πάρα πολύ ωραία. Ανάμεσα στα πρόσωπα που υπάρχουν στο μυθιστόρημά του είναι και του Καβάφη βέβαια, γιατί ο Φώστερ ταξίδεψε μεν στην Ινδία, αλλά για ένα διάστημα εργαζόταν για τον Ερυθρό Σταυρό στην Αλεξάνδρεια, όσο ήταν υπό εγγλέζικη κατοχή, και μάζευε μαρτυρίες από τους τραυματισμένους. Και εκεί, σε αυτή τη διαμονή του στην Αλεξάνδρεια, γνώρισε τον Καβάφη. Υπάρχει και η αλληλογραφία τους, έχει βγει από τον Ίκαρο εδώ. Δεν γίνανε ποτέ πολύ στενοί φίλοι, αλλά ο Φώστερ συνέβαλε τα μέγιστα στο να μεταφραστούν και να διαδοθούν τα ποίηματα του Καβάφη.
Σοβαρό ρόλο,
Ένας άλλος πραγματικό πρόσωπο που παίζει ρόλο είναι ο Λέοναρντ Γούλφ, ο σύζυγος της Βιρτζίνια Γούλφ, ο οποίος ήταν ο άνθρωπος που έδωσε σπρώξιμο στον Φώστερ να μην παρατήσει το μυθιστόρημά του, το πέρασμα στην Ινδία, να το ξαναδιαβάσει και να κοιτάξει μήπως το ολοκληρώσει επιτέλους. Και πράγματι αυτό έγινε. Το δέσιμο του Φώστερ με την Ινδία οφειλότανε σε ένα νεαρό Ινδό που είχε γνωρίσει ο ίδιος στα νεανικά του χρόνια, ο οποίος είχε έρθει από την Ινδία στην Αγγλία για να σπουδάσει και δεθήκανε με ένα δεσμό φιλίας για όλη τους τη ζωή. Ήταν αντικείμενο του πόθου του Φώστερ, ο Ινδός, αλλά δεν ενέδωσε ποτέ. Όποιον ερωτευόταν ο Φώστερ, αυτός στο τέλος κατέληγε παντρεμένος με παιδιά και ήταν ο άνθρωπος, δεν γνώρισε ποτέ τον έρωτα στη σαρκική του εκδοχή, ας πούμε, πιο πολύ γύρευε το συναίσθημα. Και ενώ Ήταν ένας άνθρωπος βασανισμένος. Το πορτρέτο που δίνει ο Γκάλκουτ εδώ δεν είναι ενός ανθρώπου που έχει υποταγή στο βασανό του. Το αντίθετο, που παλεύει μια ζωή να συμφιλιωθεί με αυτά που ο κόσμος του προσέφερε. Πάρα πολύ ωραίο βιβλίο, μου κάνει πολύ καλή εντύπωση και στη δομή του και στο γράψιμό του. Έχει μια αλήθεια μέσα και σου λέω, φανερώνεται και μια προσωπικότητα πάρα πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα, που είδε με πολύ καθαρό μάτι την αγγλική κυριαρχία στην Ινδία και συνειδητοποίησε ότι όσο καλά αισθήματα και να έχεις απέναντι στους Ινδούς, η συμφιλίωση Άγγλων και Ινδών δεν ήταν εύκολη. Καθόλου. Και επίσης κάτι άλλο που βλέπεις πολύ καθαρά σε αυτό το μυθιστόρημα είναι πως η σεξουαλική ιδιαιτερότητα σε ορισμένους ανθρώπους είναι η πόρτα για να κατανοήσουν και ταξικά θέματα. Είναι η πόρτα για να συναναστραφούν ανθρώπους από άλλη κοινωνική τάξη. Βλέπουν πιο καθαρά από αυτούς που είναι μέσα στο παιχνίδι, γιατί είναι στο περιθώριο της κοινωνίας και το βλέπουν πολύ πιο καθαρά.
Μάλιστα.
Και για το τέλος, μια μελέτη της Αγγέλας Καστρινάκη, Μίλα Πινελόπη, από τις Πανεπιστημιακές Εκδόσεις Κρήτης. Υπάρχει και μια συλλογή διηγημάτων της Αγγέλας Καστρινάκη, οι εκδοχές της Πινελόπης, που είναι διηγήματα, πολλά από τα οποία εμπνέονται από την ομηρική ηρωίδα. Λοιπόν, εδώ είναι μια επιστημονική μελέτη, γραμμένη όμως τόσο δροσερά, τόσο ανάλαφρα, με την καλή έννοια, τόσο περιπαιχτικά. Γράφει πολύ ωραία η Καστρινάκη και εδώ μας ξεναγεί στις λογοτεχνικές μεταμορφώσεις της Πινελόπης, στο πέρασμα των αιώνων, κυρίως από το δεύτερο μισό του 19ου μέχρι τις μέρες μας. Και φυσικά το συμπέρασμά της είναι ότι όσο πιο πολύ ανεβαίνει η θέση της γυναίκας στην κοινωνία, τόσο περισσότερες λογοτεχνικές μεταμορφώσεις της Πινελόπης έχουμε. Και το βιβλίο της μας... Καλά, έχει ένα σωρό άγνωστα ονόματα συγγραφέων μέσα και ποιητών, που εγώ, για μένα τουλάχιστον άγνωστους, που όμως έχουν ασχοληθεί με την Πινελόπη και μας τους συστήνει πολύ ωραία, αλλά ανάμεσα στους άγνωστους είναι και μερικοί πάρα πολύ γνωστοί, από το Ρίτσο, ας πούμε, και τον Καζαντζάκη, μέχρι τη Μάργαρετ Άτγουτ, την Οριάννα Φαλάτσι, έχει γράψει μυθιστόρημα που εμπνέεται από την Πινελόπη, η Ντόροθι Πάρκερ στην Αμερική. Και βλέπεις ότι η γυναίκα που στην αρχή την θεωρούσαν η προσωποποίηση της υπομονής, της αφοσίωσης, η φάντρα που περιμένει υπομονετικά τόσα χρόνια το σύντροφό της, μπορεί να μεταμορφωθεί, μπορεί να γίνει ισότιμη. Ας πούμε, το ότι ο Τζόις στη δικιά του, στον Οδυσσέα του, έχει την Πινελόπη με τη μορφή της Μόλη, η οποία δεν μπορείς να καταλάβεις πολύ ακριβώς το μυστήριό της, και αυτό ακόμα είναι μια ισότητα με τον Οδυσσέα, ότι στο μέτρο που δεν κατανοούμε και εντελώς τον Οδυσσέα, δεν κατανοούμε και αυτήν. Τέλος πάντων, δεν είναι, ανάλογα με την εποχή, η Πινελόπη φωτίστηκε διαφορετικά. Δηλαδή άλλοτε να είναι πονηρή και εκείνη σαν τον Οδυσσέα για να κουμαντάρει τους μνηστήρες και τα του οίκου της. Καλλιτέχνης, όχι απλή φάντρα. Ανάλογα, σου λέω, με το, ειδικά τα χρόνια του φεμινισμού, υπήρξε έξαρση. Ωραίο θέμα.
Και πολλές μεταμορφώσεις της Πινελόπης.
Βεβαίως. Και μίλα Πινελόπη, πέστα, ας πούμε.
Ναι. Επιτέλους.
Από τις λίγες έτσι μελέτες που διαβάζονται τόσο ευχάριστα. Είναι φοβερό.
Ωραία. Ευχαριστούμε, Σταυρούλα. Ευχαριστούμε και εσάς, κυρίες και κύριοι, που ήσασταν και απόψε κοντά μας. Γεια σας.